All right. Welcome. We're going to talk to you about a little bit here today is a couple of different topics. We're obviously going to talk mostly about um, composting as an option if rendering goes away. And we're going to do that in the context of foreign animal disease outbreak. I know we've been talking a lot about that. Particularly everything got ramped up once African swine fever really started to move throughout Asia and then into the Dominican Republic in 2021. So still need to continue to always be thinking about that, always be working of it. But we know at times you can get a little bit of FAD preparation fatigue, right? So we're just trying to take little bits and pieces of it. And that's one that we wanted to focus on today, particularly as we're coming into some warmer weather, is thinking about a nice time to look at practicing that, because there is a scenario which we will discuss here today where we may get into a situation during an FAD outbreak where rendering may go away temporarily. So if that's the case and you're utilizing rendering, you're going to want to be able to look at some other options. And we're going to spend most of our time talking about composting today. We'll also talk just a little bit at the end as we have a little bit of time about what we're kind of seeing this fall and winter in terms of PRRS. So we'll talk a little bit, not necessarily that we know a lot, unfortunately, what to do about it, but maybe we'll explain a little bit of why we're seeing what we're seeing. So from an FAD preparation, like we say, we've really done a nice job here in the last 7 to 8 years of standing up a lot of different programs. Unfortunately, they all come with their own acronyms, right? So in the swine industry, we tend to be very good about that. But all these different programs really kind of have three main pillars that are fundamental to all these different programs. And are things that we need to be thinking about and making sure that we're prepared while we're in peacetime, not waiting until the outbreak when we're in wartime and then, oh yeah, that's right, I did hear something about that during a meeting once. What did we talk about again? And now I got to try to find this. So that's really what we're trying to focus on, is trying to be as prepared as possible before that day comes, if it does indeed come. So those fundamental things certainly are traceability. We know that the National Pork Producers Council has been really working on pushing that as one of their core focus areas, because we know, particularly in the event of a foreign animal disease, our ability to contain it will really depend on how quickly we can find it. And that's going to be highly dependent on our ability to track and trace the movements of all the pigs that move around the U.S. It's been calculated that any day here in the U.S. there's over 1 million pigs that are on the road at any one time. So we're a pretty mobile industry. So we're going to need to be able to recall as we do our contact tracing during an FAD outbreak to know where everything has been and potentially contact with that infected site for the last 30 days. Biosecurity, obviously, we continue to deal with that in terms of the endemic diseases such as PRRS and PED, but that will probably step up to another level in a foreign animal disease outbreak. And then surveillance, so testing will certainly be a critical piece of our FAD response as well. So what happens when the first FAD case is diagnosed? So we talk about FAD standing for foreign animal disease, right? So that's any disease that's not presently here. So technically in 2014, when PED came to the US, that technically was a foreign animal disease, but it doesn't receive the same classification in what we're talking about with FAD prep. In terms of FAD, we're really talking about the three trade restricting diseases that are defined as from the World Organization of Animal Health. Those are African swine fever, classical swine fever, and foot and mouth disease. So what happens with that, if we have any of those diagnosed here in the United States, is we're going to lose our exports immediately, and then we'll have to work to get those back. So we're going to talk about U.S. ship in a moment. That's a very important piece, probably one of the more important things you can do in terms of FAD preparation, because it integrates those three different pillars together. But when and if we do have the first case, what's going to happen is the Secretary of Agriculture is going to get on the news, and they are going to declare that the first case of any one of those three diseases has been found. At that time, they will also announce what will be called a national movement standstill. So what does that mean? That means we are no longer going to move any animals once that FAD disease has been diagnosed here in the U.S. temporarily. until we can really find where the virus is and limit the spread. So what's all going to be involved with that? Well, certainly we expect that there'll be animals will be involved. Semen could be involved, could involve manure, could involve feed, depending on the extent of the outbreak, deliveries. And I did mark rendering in there as that there is a possibility that rendering will be involved in that stop movement as well. And we say could because it really depends on the extent of the outbreak, right? If the outbreak is in a feral pig in Florida, the response is we're still going to go through the national movement standstill, but that response and what's all involved in the standstill is going to look different than if we find it in 4 different production sites in Iowa that have no epidemiological links between them. That response is going to look very different. So you may have heard, if you've heard that talk about a standstill in the past, they may refer to it as a 72-hour standstill, and that is correct. That will be the minimum amount of time that that standstill will take place. And what they will do at the end of that 72 hours will be is, okay, do we feel like we have all our tracebacks done? So where's the infected site? What are all the pigs that have either gone to or have been moved off that site within the last 30 days? And then any of those related pigs, what pigs have, or sites have touched those, right? So that's all the contact tracing. If you remember during the early days of COVID, right, they were doing all these contact tracing around the early cases. That's what they'll be doing. So once again, this ties back to FAD preparation, because if at the end of 72 hours, they don't feel like they've done all that contact tracing, they're going to extend that longer. So it's 72-hour minimum, but certainly could be much longer. So what's our commitment? Our goal is to try to keep that to 72 hours if we can, or at least minimize that amount of standstill time. And the best way we can do that is to really be is to be as FAD prepared as possible. And like I said, we're going to talk about US ship here in a second. That's a great way to help practice being FAD prepared, having all your movements captured electronically so that if you are involved in that investigation, you can very quickly upload those movements into the epidemiological database that the state and federal people are using for them to quickly complete that contact tracing. They'll draw their quarantines around any of the infected and any potential infected contact sites. And then at the end of that, once they feel like they've done all their investigations, then they will go ahead and lift that. So that, once again, ties back to why FAD preparation is going to be so important for the entire industry. So at the initiation of the standstill, all new movements will stop. So everything that is in transit at that time will be allowed to go on to their final destination. So it's a little bit like 9/11, right? No new flights were allowed to take off. Everything that was in the air, please proceed to your final destination. So that's why we want to continue to talk about it. We're going to narrow in to focus about rendering and what we're going to do with daily mortalities if rendering goes away. But it really is still part of this larger conversation to say every month we should be thinking of 1 to 2 things that we can be doing to be prepared when and if this ever happens. So just as an example, what will that look like? So let's say you have, they'll certainly draw one of these control areas around the infected site. So there may be multiple control areas because they may choose to draw it around anything that's had any intimate contact with that infected sites. All those pig farms within those control areas will be temporarily quarantined. So what does that mean? That means those farms will need a movement permit to move animals or semen or even feed any animals or animal products into or out of that control area until that quarantine's been lifted. So just a little bit to try to think about what that process all looks like. So let's assume we just have one infected site. If that's the case and you happen to be the infected site, you're going to get a lot of help from the state and federal officials. They already have a playbook. Here, the African swine fever is referred to as the Green Book that will basically dictate. They'll be working with the producers to help them with depopulation disposal. But you still need to be thinking, if my site is one of those sites that are infected, what land am I going to bury? How am I going to find the material that I need to do? Do I have enough land to be able to bury all the animals on my operation? Those are still part of that FAD preparation that we should be doing now while we don't have the disease. But here you can see we have in that control zone. Now the control zones could be various of sizes. Typically, they start out with these 10 kilometers or about 6-mile circles around the infected sites. So here you see in green, you've got 2 sites that are in the control area, but they're not infected. Okay, but they're still going to need the movement permit. So they're going to need to show evidence that they have enhanced biosecurity. They'll probably have to do some surveillance testing to be able to prove that they don't have the disease. And then they'll need to get a movement permit to be able to move anything into or out of those farms. So where this ties in a little bit with US Ship is, well, what about everybody else? Let's assume we just have one infected site and one quarantine area. What's going to happen to everybody else? So once again, US Ship is a nice way to help get prepared, both from the standpoint of preventing the disease or even after the outbreak to be able to demonstrate that you are free of the disease in order to help resume back to a more normal production operating process. So US Ship, it started as a voluntary program. We're in about year 5 of it. It's actually now been codified into the national regulation. So it's actually being incorporated into the USDA. Now it's still a voluntary program at this time, and you still have a collaboration effort between academia, between pork producers, and between the state and animal health officials that work through on a yearly basis. They have a House of Delegates meetings where they decide on new standards and new programs and ways to update this. But you can see within that program, you have these 3 pillars. You have the sampling and testing. That's the surveillance piece of it. You have the biosecurity piece. And then you have this traceability piece. And really, we try to liken to it as a passport, right? You want to be able to say before the outbreak to prevent, we're doing all we can to prevent any foreign animal disease from coming in. But then even afterwards to say, yep, we can prove through these series of steps that we have by being enrolled that we can prove that we have freedom of disease in order to resume normal production operations. So US Ship is really kind of modeled after the National Poultry Improvement Plan, which has been around for about 90 years already. And like I say, the focus really is the prevention of the disease and the demonstration of freedom of disease outside of any of those control areas. What are the requirements for an enrollment? Pretty simple, pretty easy. Like I say, great opportunity here during during peacetime to be FAD prepared. You just need a premise identification. You need a VCPR with a veterinarian, a current one, just a validation and verification you're doing no garbage or swill feeding of those swine, that any international visitors observe 5 days downtime once they're here in the continental US before they enter the farm. They complete a biosecurity survey, and then probably the most important piece is that they're keeping their live animal movement records electronically, and then they practice sharing those routinely with the official state agency. Here in Iowa, the official state agency is the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. So that way, we know we're already keeping that electronically. So if we do get into an FAD investigation standpoint, we can very quickly send those records off so that they can complete their investigation very quickly. And then there are no sampling or testing requirements for US Ship while we're in peacetime. So that's all I'm going to talk to you about that. If you want more information, you can grab me during the break, talk to Zoe. Zoe has some information. We have some QR codes there that you can scan with your phone. You can also go to Google and just Google type in US Swine Health Improvement Plan, and the website should pop up. They'll walk you through how the steps to get enrolled if you are not already enrolled. If you're already enrolled, thank you very much, and I sure appreciate you doing that. So let's talk a little bit about disposal methods. What are some of the options if rendering is not available? Deep burial certainly would be one. Not one we typically want to use for routine mortalities. Has been talked about working closely with the DNR if this is something that you would consider. But you certainly that certainly is an option. There is some limitations though around it. The limit is 44 pigs per acre. And there are some regulations around setbacks, not having it in the floodplains. And the biggest concern we have from a disease transmission standpoint is that deep burial, there is concern that the leachate that comes off those animals could eventually get into the water table. And as we're starting to learn a little bit more about water biology, what we're starting to find out is that some of these viruses can and do and move throughout water supplies. So that certainly could be a potential concern. Do you have land and is it eligible for livestock burial? Well, this website here, you see the link right underneath the picture. There is a map available that you can go and look at, or you can call and work with your local DNR agents to see if you have land that would meet that criteria. Shallow burial, that is one of the more recent techniques that have been looked at, particularly for the mass casualty events. And it really is just as described, right? It's a series of long, shallow trenches, typically only about 2 feet deep. And the idea with that is to kind of keep it away from the water table, so none of that leachate makes it to the water table. But essentially what you see here is you could dig a series of these trenches. You're going to put carbon on the bottom of those trenches, lay the carcasses on them, then cover them back up, either plant grass or you could farm over the top of them. There's been a lot of research that's ongoing at South Dakota State and Oklahoma State to see if the shallow burial will indeed inactivate viruses. Composting, that's where we'll spend most of the time talking about here. Certainly that is appealing from a state and federal response in terms of disease transmission, because it's really designed to kind of keep it on site. We've seen some more permanent structures built on sites like this, where you've got concrete floors and concrete dividers and a sloped tin roof kind of overhead of it. Or you can even do some, if you wanted to do a makeshift, if you needed to put one in, if we had an FAD and you needed, rendering was your primary method and that went away for a while, there certainly are designs out there for building some temporary ones, just using some round bales here. And you see a picture of that on the screen as well. The biggest key with that, with composting, is lots of questions about carbon source and how do you build the pile. We'll cover that here. What are some of your options? What should you be thinking about? So on and so forth. So the remainder of these slides here, I actually got from Chris Cole, who's one of our extension ag engineers. And it's really just kind of a flow model, if you think about it. What are kind of the inputs to a successful process? So essentially, into your pile, you're going to put the animal mortalities and the co-compost material. You need to make sure that it gets air. You need to be able to make sure that your composting also is designed so that you can release water, heat, and carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And then after a period of time, you should finish with a finished composting product. So what are some of the fundamental parameters that affect this composting process? There's really 5 main things. Now, the nice thing about them is they have fairly wide operating ranges. So you don't really need to dial in necessarily on any one of them, other than temperature is probably the most important one that you just need to monitor. So there's things such as moisture content, carbon to nitrogen ratio, oxygen content, temperature, and then particle size of the composting material itself. Let's talk about moisture content. So there is a range there. You don't want it too dry and you don't want it too wet. If you get it too dry, really what we're relying on is a group of what's called thermophilic bacteria. They're actually what's working on the carcasses to break them down and convert them into the composted product. They need to be able to maintain at the proper temperature and the proper amount of moisture. So they do need some moisture in there in order for those bacteria to function well. But typically, because we're putting in carcasses and carcasses are about 80% water, that's usually not a very big problem that you're going to have a compost pile, particularly here in Iowa, that's going to be too dry. It's usually the bigger challenge can be is that we get the compost piles too wet. Okay. And usually what happens with that is if we get too much water in there, the water then will trap the gases working with depending on your compost material, you'll kind of form this seal so that no air can get in and none of those gases will be allowed to escape. And then what happens there, instead of the thermophilic bacteria that are working on the carcasses to make it into compost material, you get these anaerobic conditions where you get these other type of bacteria, which are the ones that really cause the really nasty odor, will become the predominant ones, and you'll have carcasses that won't be composted and that smell very bad either. So that's usually the biggest thing, is just making sure that they don't get too wet. Oxygen, so we say that's a primary component. We need to make sure in order to feed those bacteria, they're getting the proper amount of air coming in there. And that's really a big reason that we kind of start the composting pile, which I'll show you a diagram here in a little bit. We start with a nice base of about 18 to 24 inches of compost material. And part of that is to make sure that we're able to get air into that middle where the carcasses are. And if you get into a situation where it's too wet, or if we're not getting enough air in there, turning may actually help that. If you get a situation where we're not getting oxygen and you're starting to get some of those anaerobic conditions, and they don't smell very good, you may actually have to turn it in order to get some oxygen in there. But once again, generally not a big concern or condition. The one that you do have to probably actively monitor the most is the temperature. So the best tool you can use there is a compost thermometer, generally 36 to 48 inches in length, but readily available. I found that picture there on the right on Amazon for about $50. So pretty low cost piece of equipment in order to make sure that your compost piles are working properly. The recommended operating range for those are about 110 to 150 degrees. That's kind of the range at which those thermophilic bacteria are going to work very well. Now, the thing about that is, we're thinking from a pathogen inactivation standpoint, if those temperatures get above 135, that's going to kill most human and animal pathogens. So you see in that picture down there in the lower right-hand corner with the letter D there, that's actually a research study that was done composting African swine fever infected carcasses in Lithuania during the middle of winter, where it's extremely cold. So you can see the compost pile. You see the arrows there are 3 compost temperature probes that are put in there, and you can't quite see it, but they're all reading about 140 to 150 degrees in the dead of winter. And the research that they did basically showed after about 3 days above 140 degrees, they took the pieces of those infected carcasses, tested them for African swine fever, and they couldn't find any active African swine fever. So very effective at eliminating that. So if it can eliminate African swine fever, that means it's also going to kill PRRS, PED, influenza, any of our swine pathogens as well. But we don't want our piles to get too warm once again. So anything exceeding 160 degrees, then we run into the situation where those beneficial bacteria will either die or go dormant, and it may lead to a premature shutdown of your pile. So in that case, if you do run into that situation, you may need to turn that pile in order to limit that necessary maximum temperature and kind of start that process back over. We talk about compost particle size as being another important piece of that. So this is a little bit, once again, there's a range. You don't want it too small. You don't want it too large. The smaller the particles, though, the more surface area that's exposed to those carcasses, it will result in a faster compost for sure. Ideally, what you want is a mixture of large and small particles. That actually works the best. If you get too many small particles, what happens is you get no porosity, so that means you're not getting any oxygen in, and you're not allowing any of those gases to escape. But if you have too large of particles, then you're actually not trapping that heat and keeping your compost pile warm enough either. So the recommended particle size range will be somewhere between 1/8 to 2 inch in diameter, and the best is to actually have a mixture of sizes. So what makes good compost material? So there's actually a really good fact sheet put out by the USDA. So if you just Google USDA composting livestock, it was done in 2017. That goes through a lot of these different steps. And I just took this from one of the figures they had in there about approved and not approved composting material, or what made for that. So generally in the approved category, we're looking at wood chips that are 2 inches in size or less. Wood shavings, sawdust, but sawdust as a part of a composting material, not sawdust alone, once again, because if the particle size is so small, you're going to wind up with that low porosity, you're not going to get good gas exchange there with that. So sawdust can be a part, but not all of it. Chopped hay or straw, chopped corn stover, straw itself or dry mammalian bedding or manure. Actually, Chris Cole, when he was doing some stuff back around the COVID supply chain disruption time period, he was actually doing some stuff looking at pack from a beef cattle feed yard and using that as his carbon source, and it was having good success with that. So what are some things that don't work well or are not approved? So large logs or branches, once again, because you don't expose a lot of surface area, you're going to have very large porosity. You're not going to hold the heat in. Grass clippings, you can put some in there, but it shouldn't exceed 5% of the total compost material. Ground construction or demolition debris is not doesn't work very well. Painted or pressure treated wood. Soil sand, carbon source that has a lot of excess liquid, or leachate also are not good composting materials. So what should that pile look like as you're putting that together? So generally you're going to wind up with a really wide base, so about 15 to 20 feet wide. You're going to put a base layer of 18 to 24 inches of your carbon source, your bulking agent there. You'll go ahead and place your mortalities then in a single layer over that base layer, and then make sure you're at least 6 inches from the edge. And part of that is we want to make sure if we keep them too close to the edge, you can have issues with scavengers digging through the pile and trying to pull those carcass mortalities out. So you want to make sure they're at least 6 inches from the edge of your piles. And then you're going to want to go ahead and cover with another 18 to 24 inches of bulking agent, kind of up in a mound shape. And so the very tip top of your mound in your compost pile really shouldn't exceed about 8 feet in total height. So kind of an operation and maintenance of your pile, you should monitor that temperature, and it should reach greater than 110 degrees in about 5 days, and then should really maintain anywhere between 130 to 160 degrees after that. Like I say, turning that pile may be necessary if you are monitoring that and you're getting to a point where that composting process hasn't been finished and your temperature starts to drop and it gets to be less than 100 degrees. And then you want to make sure you're regularly inspecting and maintaining that cover, because maintaining that cover will help maintain that temperature range and then also discourage scavengers as well. Will there be bones? It depends on the size of animals that you're composting. Probably yes. The composting process is probably going to take somewhere between 2.5 and 3 months. But you're probably going to have, particularly if you have large carcasses, you may have some of those large long bones or parts and pieces of the skull that still may be left over at the end of that process. So you kind of in summary, we've got these 5 different parameters, but they have these really wide ranges, so they're relatively easy to achieve that. So you don't need to worry about trying to optimize each of those parameters. The biggest thing is make sure you're monitoring your temperature, and then make sure that you don't have excessive moisture. That's probably the biggest concern. And like you say, your carcasses that you're putting on there are made up of 80% water, so you really shouldn't have to worry about adding any water to that pile. And the idea from an FAD preparation standpoint is if we do get into a situation where they suspect that rendering may be part of the transmission, that may be one thing that gets pulled away. So now's the time to start getting some experience with composting, right? Take a week of your regular mortalities and, just try it. If you need any help, certainly we can reach out to the extension agriculture engineers to help you get them set up if you have any questions. But we want to make sure we're practicing, kind of learning, refining that process now if rendering goes away. I just looked at the U.S. SHIP enrollment. So there's about 10,000 sites across the U.S. that have been enrolled in SHIP, and about 61% of those sites are still using rendering as their mortality removal process, right? So that means if that goes into the order, there's 60% of those sites are going to have to find another option. So now is a good time to do it in wartime, in peacetime. Don't wait till wartime. Another option, depending on if you have the equipment, is to actually grind and then compost. So you're actually going to grind the compost material and the carcasses together, either with a tree grinder or a tub grinder, cattle tub grinder I know some people have used. essentially what you do is as you're running them through, you're putting equal parts compost material, either straw, corn stalks, wood chips, and carcasses. I had the opportunity to see a couple of these in operation during the COVID supply chain disruption, and they were doing about 10 carcasses or so per minute. And really all you saw at the end was all the compost material and lots of hair and hides. I mean, they really do a good job of taking those carcasses and just shrinking them down to really small sizes. The estimated material, because you have so much surface area of that, you're going to achieve, the rapid composting, right? So they were getting like 165 degrees in a couple of days, and they were completely composted within 30 days. So obviously a process that goes much faster, but a much bigger capital investment in order to do something like that. Here we have on the Iowa Pork Industry Center website, we have a lot of foreign animal disease preparation resources. One of those is just a checklist of priorities, right? And the idea with it is not to try to tackle all this at once, but just try to do one to two of these each month, as we're trying to get prepared. But as I said, there's probably no greater thing that we can do, and then make sure your site gets signed up for US ship. Okay. Let's spend a little bit of time of our remaining time just talking about what's going on with PRRS. Certainly, we've seen at the diagnostic lab, we hear up in the production animal medicine group about the challenges that everyone is experiencing with PRRS, particularly this late fall into early winter as well. So I just wanted to share with you some of the information that we're able to have access to, but you have access to this information as well. So our field epi group there on campus put in for a grant, a USDA grant, and part of that was some extension work so that we can get this information back to the producers, but was to put together what's called the swine disease reporting system. Okay, so you see there on the bottom of the slide, you have access to all these reports that I'm going to show you here. What that swine disease reporting system does is it takes all the diagnostic data from the 6 main diagnostic laboratories in the United States. That does about 98% of the swine work in the US. So it's a really good representation of what we're seeing across the industry. But you have access to all those reports if you go to fieldepi.org and go to the SDRS tabs. You can look at this all in real time. Otherwise, they put out a monthly PDF report where they track PRRS, PED, PCV2, influenza. Now I think they're working on E. coli and Seneca virus as well. But, what we've seen, the one on the left here, you can see kind of a 3-year rolling trend by week of the year, and then the percent positives. And, typically what we see is, the prevalence goes down during the summer, and then generally as we get into fall, usually about week 40, we see a pretty dramatic increase in the percent positives. And you see on the chart over to the right, you break them up by the different age groups. You especially see it there in the wean to market, right? So we see that starting in October, we went kind of from 35% positives up to almost near 50% of the samples that we're turning in have positive results in them. And then generally what we see is we see positives in the wean to finish sites first, and then usually about a month or so behind the sow farms lag behind them. And that trend we've seen over all 3 years that we've looked at this on this SDRS tool. One of the things that we can look at in terms of PRRS, we also look at the different sequences and then start to group them. So we used to group them by those 3-letter numbers, right? 144, 142, 124, 174. Well, we're starting to use this lineage process because part of that is like 144 is a really large group, and the lineages will actually subdivide those into smaller groups that are more related. So some of the ones that you're seeing here are L1C.5, which we saw kind of emerge right at the end of COVID, and then L1C.2. These are probably the 2 of the more prevalent ones that we've seen over this past winter, compared to some of these older ones that we don't see near as much as what we used to see. The other thing that SDRS report also looks at is it will group them by state, and then looks at which one are we seeing first most frequently, second most frequently, and third most frequently. So you kind of see there in orange, we have the L1C.5. That's the most frequent one. And we can see that's the most prevalent one here that we see in Iowa, followed by the one in blue, which is the L1C.2, which is the most prevalent one in Illinois and the third most prevalent one in Minnesota. So there's an advisory board that looks at all this data every month on a call, and then they share kind of their observations with the field epi team as well. So I kind of listed there on the bottom some of the comments that the advisory board gave on the most recent report, which was released at the end of January. And it says that the advisory group highlighted that the lineage L1C.2 caused significant clinical issues leading to depopulation of sow farms and poor production records. Some mentioned that it is severely affecting wean to finish sites in 2025 with high mortality rates and minimal responses to treatments. So certainly that's what we've been hearing. Went to Pork Congress, certainly heard that from, people on all four corners of the state of Iowa, right? Very similar stories as to that. So we took that information, we went into a different database that we have that we're working on, which is called the PRRS Outbreak Management Program, or POMP. Now that works just with breeding herds, and what that does is farms enroll their breeding herds when they go through a PRRS outbreak. They fill out a survey, and then they track and see how long it takes those farms to recover. And then what we can do with that is we can measure all these different variables on the survey and see, look for trends, are there certain management practices that allow those farms to return back to stability quicker, or are there things that prolong that? So one of the things that we looked at are these lineages, right? So what you see there in the red boxes are the L1C.2 and L1C.5. What you're looking at is the impact of lineages on total losses of pre-weaned pigs per 1,000 sows, okay? So these are box and whisker plots. You see the total losses there on to the left. So what we tend to look at is the middle bar in those middle of those boxes. That's the 50% level, right? So at the 50% level on those two virus groups, they're looking at about 6,000 weaned pigs lost per 1,000 sows. So on a 5,000 sow farm, that's losing 30,000 weaned pigs per outbreak. And that's talking nothing about what happens to the downstream pigs, which, we're starting to hear, obviously, and was reflected in the previous slide. There's certainly high mortality in the downstream pigs as well. So certainly these are the two most prevalent viruses, and certainly from what it appears like clinically, it causes the most damage on the sow farms and most likely in grow finish as well. So we had Dr. Zhang, which is one of our virologists at Iowa State. He did what's called a classic virological study back in 2021, right after the L1C.5 first emerged, okay? So what he did is he took a group of about 50 pigs, and then he looked at 6 different treatment groups, okay? And he looked at all these different viruses and challenged them with them, okay? So what you're looking at, these are pictures of these pens of pigs 6 days after he infected them. So here you have negative control. Here's the 144 L1H, L1A, L1C, but not a variant. And that time L1C was called a variant. This is now that L1C.5 that we just looked at. And then you see the 174L1, okay? All right, so this is the interactive portion of our program here for our live audience. Which one of these do not look like the others? I'll give you a hint because we're a little shy in here. What's different about those two pens compared to the other 4 pens? Yeah. Looks like they're piling, right? They look sick. Yeah, right. They look viremic. That's exactly right. Now, the interesting thing about that, and you're right, they do have PRRS virus in them, right? But so do these, so do these, and so do these. The only pigs in this picture that don't have pigs are the negative control. Sorry, the only pigs that don't have PRRS are the negative control. So what's funny about that is that these pigs, these 3 pigs with these viruses, they look an awful lot like the negative control pigs, don't they? So that's what they look like 6 days after infection. So what Dr. Zhang did is challenged them, let them go for 14 days, and then at the end of 14 days, he euthanized the survivors, and then he started to look at them underneath the microscope, started to look at how much damage was caused by PRRS by all these different strains. And then he also counted how much virus was in the serum of all these different strains that he's looking at here. So these two in red, those are some of the, probably two of the more recent viruses. These other three viruses are much older lineages, okay? So remember these as we go to these next slides. Okay, one of the things we just looked at was mortality. Now, we weren't dealing with a lot of pigs, right? There's only 8 pigs in each of those pens. And what you see was the L1C variant, or the L1C.5, the mortality was really high in them, right? So 6 out of the 8 pigs either died or had to be euthanized due to animal well-being concerns. All right, this one, these next two slides are pretty telling when we look at what we saw with those pictures and what we saw when they started to look underneath the microscope. So I really want you to focus on the graph on the left, okay? So on the bottom there are your 6 different groups. The one there is the letter C. Those are the negative control pigs. Those pigs didn't have any PRRS. So what we're looking at over here on the y-axis is the percentage of their lungs that had PRRS lesions. So the negative control pigs, as you would expect, had 0% lung lesions, right? So they look completely fine, completely normal. Then what you see is the L1C variant there in deep blue or purple. 95% of their lungs were affected by PRRS. If you look over here in red, that was the L1A, 174, L1A, that was the other group that was piling. 85% of their lungs were impacted by PRRS. Okay, so very high in those two groups. Let's look at those other 3 groups that were kind of standing around and looked pretty normal clinically compared to the negative control pigs. Well, you're only looking at about 20 to 40% of their lungs were impacted compared to those other 2 strains, right? So significantly less damage due to PRRS in their lungs compared to these 2 newer strains. So that was certainly one of the takeaways. The other thing he did is, let's count the amount of virus in a mill of serum from each of these infected pigs of these different variants. And I'm going to kind of pull you in because it's a little bit hard to see here. But what we're looking at is, this is the amount of virus on a log scale. So for each number that you go up, you're adding a 0 at the end, right? So we're talking about lots of PRRS viruses in a mill of serum. But if you look at that, the L1C.5, so the one that they looked pretty sick and we lost 6 out of the 8, those pigs had 9 logs of serum. And if we compare that to these other 3 strains, that's like 1 million more virus particles per mill than those other strains of viruses. So really, what we're seeing between that and the slide on the amount of damage to the lungs, these newer variants that we're seeing, their ability to cause disease is just so much more than these older strains, right? A lot higher lung damage, a lot higher amount of virus in the body. Those pigs have a very difficult time mounting any sort of immune response at all. Thus is the reason why before, with some of those older strains, a bad group might be 10 to 15%. Now we start hearing stories of 30, maybe up to 50, even up to 70% wean to finish groups mortality due to PRRS with some of these newer strains. So that's the thing. We can kind of explain it. What to do about it, that unfortunately is another story, right? We're seeing this evolution where we're selecting for strains that are much more pathogenic, but we're not really finding, we're learning as much as we can about trying to prevent and biosecurity, but in terms of treatment, we're not learning a lot more about that, or certainly not keeping pace with these newer strains, right? We're still finding that vaccinated pigs still tend to do better and tend to have lower mortality than non-vaccinated pigs. But it's not like you go from 70% to 5%, right? I mean, in general, it's still the right thing to do. Supportive therapy, that's what we hear a lot of people doing. I'd say do everything you can do from a management, warm the barns up, make sure they've got plenty of water, make sure we're not chilling them. There's some anecdotal reports, about making sure they have excess, vitamins or vitamin packs or things like that, but none of that's gone through scientific rigor and have been proven out to demonstrate value. But we hear people doing that type of stuff. I mean, a lot of it is just, if we do have it, let's do what we can to prevent it, spreading to other sites, right? Infecting other pigs. So that may be another reason also that you may want to consider composting over rendering, right? Because we do know that rendering is certainly a risk factor, moving viruses around, pathogens around from one farm to the next. There are some additional tools we have graduate students working on if you have breeding herds. And this is really utilizing some advanced AI type techniques looking at production data to early predict outbreaks. So they've been able to do, if they're able to get weekly production data in, they're able to determine on some key indicators like abortions, pre-wean mortality, sow mortality. In some cases, they're able to look at that with the production records to be able to detect, a PRRS outbreak or a flare-up before they even see it manifest itself in a big clinical abortion storm, say, on a sow farm. Here's just a little bit of work of that done. The big thing there is the average early detection. So looking at like abortions, if they're able to get and run it through that computer model, get the production records in on a weekly basis, they can detect just through a slow rise in abortions before you hit the big peak in abortions, sometimes out to about 4 weeks prior to the clinical outbreak of abortions. They saw the same thing with pre-wean mortality, sow death, and neonatal losses. So you can see, and what it really does is just looks at all the production data, and it can start to tell, is that little blip up, is that usual or unusual compared to the last, 50, 80, however many weeks of information that you have in there. What you also find is by combining some of those, you improve your sensitivity to detect that. So in this case here, you can see the detection percentage went up. You see with pre-wean mortality and neonatal losses or dead sows and pre-wean mortality, you're still able to detect that. So if you're working in a breeding herd, you have weekly production records, that's something that you're interested in. What we can do is, as long as you're willing to send those in on a weekly basis, we can run it through the model, and then that kicks out an email to you and to say, hey, we may have a signal here that you need to look at. There's also we also here just doing the same thing on mortality for wean to finish. Same sort of process. You got to be able to send those mortalities in on a weekly basis. We can go ahead and develop, here's what normal should be. So if we see something go out of that normal range, that's abnormal. So here you see an example of, detecting, seeing that mortality raise up a week before an outbreak with parasuis, and then one here also on E. coli, so long as we get the records in on a weekly basis. So just some tools. If that's something you're interested in, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll take any questions. If there are no questions, we'll turn it over to Brian.